The March of the Cane Toad. How the cane toad impacted the Australian environment. The cane toad in Australia dates back to the early 1900s as an introduced species to control the cane beetle in Queensland sugar cane crops. Sugar cane was reported to have arrived in Australia from South Africa by way of the First Fleet in 1788. With many unsuccessful attempts to get the crop to take in areas near Port Macquarie and the northern New South Wales coast, it took until 1862 for Queensland to get serious about this as a feasible endeavour when Captain Lewis Hope and John Buholt established the first viable commercial cane plantation near Brisbane in Queensland. From those early days, the sugar industry grew and blossomed up the coast and stretches to the far north of the state for almost 2,000 kilometres. Shortly thereafter, in the far north of the state, the industry started to have problems with the larvae of the greyback beetle, or cane beetle. The grub would burrow and eat the root system of the cane, causing it to die, leaving parts of the normally lush green crops brown and bare. In the early 1900s, the problem was so bad that the Queensland government created the sugar experimental stations, where they could find techniques and methods to stop the cane beetle in trial crops. When chemicals did not work as expected and were thought to cause more harm than good, they turned to a biological control. Entomologists had heard of cane toads and their success in Hawaii to control beetles, and so a plan was hatched. Reginald W. Montgomery from Queensland's Bureau of Sugar Experimental Stations and two Hawaiian colleagues rustled up 102 toads from lawns and gardens in Honolulu on June 1, 1935. These prime specimens were then packaged and transported live with Montgomery back to Australia. They arrived on the 22nd of June 1935 in Gordonvale, just outside of Cairns in North Queensland, and were sent to the Moringa Trial Farm. The cane toad, Rhinella marina, a large species of toad that originates from Central and South America. It grows to an average size of 15 centimetres and up to 1.5 kilograms, with the largest recorded toad being 24 centimetres in length. It has brown warty skin and a creamy white underbelly, goat-like eyes with horizontal pupils. This toad breeds very quickly, where the female can lay up to 30,000 eggs in a clutch. The tadpoles are toxic to other animals that would feed on them, often causing death to small fish, frogs, and birds. The full-grown toad has skin gland that produces a venom when the animal is threatened. The venom secreted from these glands as a milky white creamy substance contains bufotoxin. If ingested, can cause increased heartbeat, excessive salivation, convulsions, paralysis, and in many cases death to those animals unfortunate enough to have eaten the toad. The toad feeds aggressively on insects, ants, snails, and as such was thought to be the perfect biological control for the cane beetle. Back at the Moringa Trial Farm in Gordonvale, the first recruits, 51 male as one had died, and 52 female toads from Hawaii, were getting acquainted with their new life in Australia, where they were kept in an enclosure dubbed the Gordonvale Gazebo. It was engineered from bird mesh wire to ensure the toads would not escape or be a victim to birds and other predators. Inside the enclosure was a fountain and a pond that had been stocked with lilies and water hyacinth to make the toads feel at home. Within a week of their arrival, females had laid eggs, and 3 days later they hatched to be the first toads bred in captivity. On the 19th of August 1935, approximately 2,400 toads were released into the Little Mulgrave River and other sites in Gordonvale, where the March of the Cane Toad was born. Unfortunately, in their haste to breed the toad, no trials were conducted on their effectiveness of controlling the cane beetle, nor the effects they would have on the local wildlife. And it was soon discovered the toads had not diminished the populations of the beetle, and is due to some obvious reasons. The cane beetle generally feeds at the top of the sugarcane stalks. They are often over 2 meters tall and where a toad could not jump. The beetle was predominantly active during the day, a complete opposite to the feeding habits of the toad, which are mainly at night. Both species are not seasonally compatible, which means they generally aren't in the same area at the same time of year. And the cane fields were drier than those in Hawaii and what they are used to in their natural habitat. So they ventured away from the cane to find more suitable habitat to live and breed, leaving the beetle population largely unscathed. What is an invasive species? An invasive species is defined as an aggressive, introduced species which spreads and dominates its new location, competing with and often replacing native species and proving very difficult to remove, also known as an invader. Many invasive species come to mind, like the rabbit, deer, wild boar, and most are introduced with the best intentions as a source of food or game or to predate on other pests. And that is exactly what the cane toad had become. With its ability to eat almost anything, reproducing in large quantities several times a year, and poisonous to most, if not all, other natural predation, this species thrived. As they continually march across the country, at first averaging 10 kilometres a year, they quickly picked up speed to around 40 kilometres a year and have spread across large areas of northern Australia, starting on the eastern seaboard coastal areas of Queensland, inland across Queensland and into the Northern Territory, and now Western Australia and parts of New South Wales. From those first 102 animals who travelled from Hawaii, they have grown into an army with an estimated population of 200 million and growing. Unfortunately for Australia's native species that would typically live in this environment, the toad has overpopulated and outcompeted them. A typical native frog produces 1 to 2,000 eggs a year, whereas the toad can produce up to 30,000. This places pressure on natives to compete for available food, and they have declined as a result from this competition. Toads also eat many other smaller animals, frogs, lizards, and fish. In addition, other species that would normally feed on frogs and their tadpoles, when trying the same with the toad, would die from the venom that the toads produce in its defense. Around 75 species in Australia are threatened by the toad and its advance west across the country. Although it is unlikely that the cane toad will ever be eradicated from Australia, as they breed too fast and can live in a broad range of habitats from the coast to the desert, most humans have learned to live with their presence, taking to capturing and humanely disposing of them when they pose a threat to domesticated animals, and even taking to racing them for charity. Here we can see the toad races on Magnetic Island off the coast of Townsville that happen every Wednesday and have been a local fixture for almost 30 years. At peak holiday season, it is not uncommon for a toad to be purchased in a sweep for $1,000, with the proceeds of the races being used for the local Arcadian Surf Life Saving Club. However, not all is lost. Whilst they have managed to affect a multitude of species, some animals are not affected by the venom, including the keelback snake, curlews, tawny frogmouths, rats, estuarine crocodiles, and crows, which have learned to flip the toad up and eat it from the underside, where the venom is not secreted. In addition, some recent research focused on the start of the toad's life cycle by targeting their tadpoles. A study used a pheromone that tadpoles produce naturally themselves when stressed to alert others to flee. When added to the water source, the study showed results of 50% of the tadpoles that were exposed to the pheromone died, likely from stress, and those that survived and emerged as toads were weaker and smaller than a typical toad. They also found that native species in the water were not affected by the release of the pheromone. More studies have used chemicals to attract toad tadpoles so that they can be removed from water bodies, and some testing with chemicals that cause larger tadpoles to kill smaller ones. Hopefully, a permanent solution can be found that resets the scale and allows the native species to thrive and increase their numbers back before when the toad was introduced.